In part 2 of our debugging series in Python, I mentioned several things to check in your code as far as syntax errors. And I think I said the number one problem I see beginning students do is often indentation issues. We didn't go into that very much in depth because we haven't really covered structures that use indentations other than in that very first workflow problem. But in this lesson, I want to focus on the indentation. We started to use if, elif, and else structures, or conditional structures, and those contain indentation. Soon we'll look at repetition structures, what we call loops. We'll follow up with a look at functions, also called methods. And all of those use indentation to create structure. And it gets a little complicated in that these can be nested. I can have an if structure inside another if fork, and I can have an if structure inside of a loop or a loop inside of an if structure, and conditionals and repetition structures can occur inside functions. And we have various levels of indentation. We saw that in the workflow on that first debugging video that I mentioned, that there are different levels of indentation. And if you get the indentation incorrect, your results may be incorrect. Python is unique in that it uses white space or indentation to create structure. Most languages, such as C#, use curly brackets to create those structures. So here we'll have an if structure, and the if fork has curly brackets around the contents of that fork, as does the else fork in this if else. Java and Kotlin and Swift are very similar in that nature. As I said, Python's a little bit unique in that it uses this white space structure. Couple rules of thumb, and where I see students getting into trouble here, is levels must be consistent. Now the standard is 4 spaces. You can use 5 spaces, you can use 3 spaces, as long as you're consistent throughout. But the standard is 4 spaces. And then third, we want to avoid mixing spaces and tabs. The reason for that is we could change the tabs to be 4 spaces and then 5 spaces. And maybe we had some lines that are 4 spaces and other lines that are tabs, and we change our tab width, then they do not align anymore. You may use tabs instead of spaces. I know some Python programmers say don't use tabs, and others use tabs a lot. I tend to use tabs as well. Some editors, and including idle, I believe, will actually convert your spaces if they're equal to the tab to an actual tab character. So the other issue in using spaces and tabs mixed is you might take your code from one editor to another, and your editor in Python may be set up for 4 spaces for tabs, but maybe in Visual Studio it's set up for 5. And then again, things don't align correctly. Let's take a look at the indentations of an if, elif, else structure. I created a simple calculator in which the user enters 2 numbers, 2 integers, and then choose an operation of addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, integer division, and modulus. Based on the operation that they submit, we will show the result. Each if, elif fork has 2 statements. One to create the result, and the second to print the result. And then the else fork happens if they didn't enter one of those 6 operators. We'll get an invalid operation print. Let me just run this, and I'm asked to enter the first number. Let's do 7 and 4, and we'll add those together. And I'm told that 7 plus 4 equals 11. Now I'm not going to take the time to do this, but if this was a project that you were doing for someone, you'd want to make sure you test all 6 of those operators and that they all work correctly. I've already tested those, and they do. Let me come back to my code, though. I'm going to add a space before my print statement in the addition. And let's run this again, or try to run it, and I get an unexpected indent. So I get a syntax error. And once I correct that, then I can run it again. I'll do multiplication this time, so 8 times 5 is 40. The indentation makes this also very readable. So it's adding structure, but it's also making our code much more readable. So you need to recognize that when you have indentations, those are part of a structure. In this case, it's an if, elif, else structure, but it could be a loop structure we'll talk about next week, or a function or method that we'll talk about in a couple weeks. Let me refactor my code a little bit so that we don't have a print statement in each block. So modifying our code to try to make it more efficient or more readable is called refactoring. Same thing here, except I'm creating the operation to find the value of C in each of the if, elif forks, and the else still says C equals invalid operation. Now my output in this case is another if else. These are separate from this if, elif, else structure. So I have consecutive conditional structures here. If C equals invalid operation, I'm going to print C. Otherwise, I'm going to print C, I'm going to print A and the operator and B equals and whatever the value of C is using our string.format. Now, did I really save much in terms of the code here of writing? Not really. There was our original. That's a couple lines shorter with this refactoring. And we can have an argument, is this more readable because it's less code, or is it harder to read because of the sequential if elifs? And what you could do here is you can add a white space line, and that does not affect the compilation of our program. And now it's a little more readable that we have an if, elif, else structure followed by an if, else structure. Again, let me run this. And I'll do that 8 and 5. And let's do a modulus operation. And 8 mod 5 is 3. 3 is the remainder of 8 divided by 5. Let's take a look at that invalid operation. I can do 8 and 5, and let's do an ampersand. And I'm told that's an invalid operation. It used to be you couldn't have one fork indented more than the others. But now you can get away with it in the idle editor. That may not be true in other editors. So as a rule of thumb, you always want to make sure that you're being consistent with your various levels of indentation. If you're not, that might come into play when you're asked to demonstrate something or show your portfolio in a job interview.
If you just jumped into this video and haven't seen the prior videos to this, I invite you to check out my Python playlist of videos. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.